My name is Clara Sterling, and I'm 37 years old. Exactly 9 minutes after my divorce was finalized, I called my father and said, "Let go of every single one of the 27 employees my in-laws forced into your business." I had spent 15 agonizing months waiting to utter those words, and I had paid for them dearly in ways I am about to explain. My father went completely quiet on the other end of the line. Then he asked me the one question I had been praying he would finally ask. I believed that phone call would be the most difficult part of my day. I was wrong. That very evening, my ex-mother-in-law stood pounding on the door of my apartment, shouting loud enough for everyone on the floor to hear. And then, when the shouting failed to work, she lowered her voice and offered me something far more dangerous than her rage. But here is what none of them realized. I had already found the empty shelf. Welcome back to their secret stories, where hidden family truths are brought to light and quiet determination wins the day. We share stories about people who stopped keeping the peace and started keeping their dignity won. If narratives about standing your ground speak to you, drop your city and time in the comments below, and please subscribe, because this journey goes to places you will not expect. Let me take a step back, because none of this makes sense without my father. Arthur Sterling founded Sterling Industrial Electrical in 1994 with a single-wire puller and a beat-up utility van that required patience and prayer to start in the winter. By the time I was in high school, the business occupied a permanent warehouse in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. The entire building smelled of warm solder and cheap chicory coffee. I grew up completing my schoolwork in the break room. I learned how to analyze commercial agreements before I learned how to drive. Mostly because my father would sign almost anything a friendly face slid across a desk, and someone in our family had to examine the fine print. That protective instinct became my career. I put myself through law school using academic scholarships and working night shifts at a local title agency. I never accepted a single dollar from my father's business, which mattered to me far more than it probably should have. When I finally came on board as general counsel and compliance manager, I had earned my place, just like the electricians in the field had earned theirs. By 2026, we employed 212 people. 212 families is how my father always described them. He knew every first name, most of their children's names, and which crew leader was currently navigating a difficult time. My role was much quieter. I drafted the agreements, identified liabilities, kept the physical records in color, coded files by calendar year, and generally acted as the most cautious person in every corporate meeting. My father used to joke that I read equipment warranty cards for relaxation. He wasn't entirely incorrect. Here is the thing about being the cautious one, though. Everyone appreciates you when you catch a mistake in a supplier's paperwork. They appreciate you significantly less when the mistake you uncover is sitting right across from them at the family dinner table. The first Vance hire was framed as a simple favor. I want you to hold on to that word. I met Julian Vance in 2015 at a local art gallery benefit chaired by his mother. He was 38 now. He was 27 then. He possessed the kind of quiet charm that seemed almost apologetic, which is often the most effective kind. He remembered my exact drink order after a single evening. He asked detailed questions and actually listened to the answers. When he introduced me to the Vance estate that autumn, I realized I was being displayed in the way one presents a structured business proposal. From the curb, the house looked magnificent. Up close, my professional habits took over, and I noticed the wooden deck frames were soft with dry rot beneath a fresh layer of white paint. Old status with depleted funds. I didn't have the terminology for it yet, but I recognized the sensation. Eleanor Vance greeted me at the entrance wearing diamond studs at 4 in the afternoon. She was welcoming in a manner that felt highly practiced, and she knew the names of every prominent figure in the county, their spouses, and where their children attended college. During dinner, she asked about my occupation. I explained that I managed contracts and regulatory compliance for my father's electrical contracting firm. Eleanor placed her fork down, smiled at me as if I had passed a silent test, and said, "Practical. That is exactly what this family requires." Everyone at the table laughed warmly, and I joined in because it sounded like praise. It took me 9 years to realize it was actually a job offer, except I was not the one being employed. I was the acquisition. Julian proposed the following spring at a venue his mother had personally selected. I accepted with my entire heart, which is the single detail I would alter if I could change only one thing in my life. We married in 2017. 200 guests attended, most of whom I had never met before. At the reception, Eleanor stood up with a glass of champagne and offered a toast that concluded with, "We protect our own." The room applauded. My father wiped a tear from his eye. I squeezed Julian's hand and believed I was the most fortunate woman in Beaver County. 6 weeks later, Eleanor called me directly. Not my father, but me. Regarding Julian's cousin Caleb. He was currently between opportunities and possessed a strong head for numbers. Our procurement department had an immediate opening. I passed his resume along to HR with a brief note identifying him as a family referral for full disclosure, and I felt quite ethical for including that detail. Caleb interviewed reasonably well. He was hired. I signed the welcoming paperwork myself, as onboarding documentation fell under my compliance department. I remember thinking how pleasant it was to see our families weaving together in such a way. I still recall that signature, not with guilt, exactly, but with the specific discomfort of a person who remembers holding the door open and saying, "Please come in. We are so glad to have you." Caleb was polite, arrived on schedule, and did nothing remarkable in either direction. I later learned this is precisely what the first placement is designed to do. The initial placement is a test balloon. You never send the actual cargo on a test run. That winter, Eleanor presented my father with a vintage watch older than I was, telling him that Sterling Industrial was the kind of local success story her family was proud to be associated with now. My father beamed. I beamed. The watch, I would eventually calculate, cost roughly 1,000th of what that single statement was about to cost us. Between 2019 and 2021, Sterling Industrial grew rapidly. We secured 3 major expansions, 2 new public works contracts, and initiated a significant hiring push to support the workload. And somewhere amidst that growth, a distinct pattern began to form. I noticed it the way you notice a very faint, unusual scent in a home you love. A scheduling assistant who happened to be Eleanor's goddaughter. An accounts payable clerk whose parent played golf with Eleanor every Tuesday. An estimator Julian personally endorsed from his professional network. Though Julian's network, as far as I could determine, consisted almost entirely of individuals his mother had introduced him to. Each resume was thin, but legally acceptable. Each interview went fine. Every single hire was processed through Beatrice Mercer, our newly appointed HR director. She had joined us, I should point out, on Eleanor's glowing recommendation, right after our previous HR manager retired unexpectedly with a separation package no one in leadership recalled officially approving. I raised the issue once during an executive meeting. I noted that our referral concentration was becoming unusually high and suggested we implement a conflict of interest policy with more authority. Beatrice laughed gently, the way one laughs at a child afraid of the dark. Clara reads equipment warranties for entertainment. She remarked, and the room chuckled, because that had become my established identity. And that identity made me incredibly easy to dismiss. My father patted my shoulder as we walked out. I want to be clear, I did not simply shrug and walk away. I drafted a formal memorandum. I updated our conflict of interest disclosure forms. I required every new employee to sign them. It felt like taking meaningful action. In a sense, it was. Years later, those signed disclosures would carry immense weight. But a compliance form is merely a seatbelt. It does not prevent another driver from aiming directly at you. By the summer of 2021, I counted 11 hires with distinct Vance connections. I was about to find out how that number would reach 27. In October 2021, my father suffered a stroke on the warehouse floor. He was 61 then, and he collapsed between 2 rows of commercial conduit. A 22-year-old apprentice managed chest compressions until the paramedics arrived. He survived. I need you to know immediately that he survived. But he was away from the office for 8 months, and the business deeply felt his absence. I spent that autumn driving back and forth between the medical center in Pittsburgh and our offices in Beaver Falls. I made a choice that I still stand by today. I prioritized my father's recovery over the company's organizational chart. While my focus was pulled elsewhere, Tristan Vance, Julian's younger brother, a 34-year-old whose previous professional background I could never quite verify, volunteered to assist us on a temporary basis. The temporary assistance turned into a permanent desk. The desk turned into the title of operations director. Julian, who had joined the firm 2 years prior as a client relations vice president, a position Eleanor had somehow negotiated into existence over a dinner I did not attend, began introducing Tristan to our public works contacts. And the hiring, which I had previously monitored like a hawk, took place while the hawk was sitting in a recovery ward holding her father's hand. 16 additional people joined the payroll during those 8 months. Beatrice processed every single one of them. When my father finally returned, noticeably thinner, slower, and with a quiet aversion to conflict that the medical emergency seemed to have left behind, he reviewed the updated organizational chart and noted that it was encouraging to see so much fresh energy in the office. I looked at the exact same document and saw a foreign transplant the host body had never officially approved. I communicated this to him quietly in his office with the door closed. He raised a hand, looking tired. That was the very first time I heard the phrase that would govern my life for the next 5 years. "You don't fire family, Clara," my father said. He wasn't angry, he was certain, in the same way he was certain about electrical currents and honest handshakes. I didn't possess concrete proof of anything yet, and I want to be entirely transparent about that. What I possessed was a lingering intuition and a physical diagram. Late one night in 2023, unable to sleep, I sat at my kitchen table and mapped out the entire company on a legal pad. I listed every single hire made since my wedding day, every line of referral, and every reporting structure. Then, using a red pen, I circled every individual connected to the Vances by blood, marriage, or personal acquaintance. When I finished, I counted the red circles twice because I simply could not believe the final tally. 27. 27 individuals placed in purchasing, accounts payable, estimating HR and operations. If you understand anything about how funds flow out of a corporation, you know that is not a random distribution. It is a supply chain. I brought the legal pad to my father the following morning. He analyzed it for a long, silent minute, and I saw something shift behind his eyes. My father is not an unintelligent man. He is a deeply loyal one, and those two traits carry different vulnerabilities. Then he slid the pad back across the desk to me. They are decent people, Clara. Eleanor's connections are decent people. You don't terminate family. He meant it as a fundamental principle. Eleanor had spent 6 years ensuring it would function as a protective shield. I took my legal pad, returned to my office, and executed the only measures I could take without requiring his signature. I lowered corporate approval thresholds, mandated dual sign-offs for all new suppliers, and quietly set up system alerts for my own account on every procurement record. It felt like stacking sandbags before a storm that everyone else insisted was just sunshine. 2 months later, I uncovered purchase order 9912, and the quietness of my life disappeared entirely. It was January 2024, and I was performing the least dramatic task imaginable: reconciling quarterly spending against industrial metal indexes. Commercial copper and wiring costs had dropped across the market that quarter. Our wiring costs, however, had not. I calculated the figures 3 times, then retrieved 2 years of billing statements from our primary conduit and cable vendor, a business called Apex Cable Distributors, LLC. We were paying, on average, 22% above standard market rates. 22% is not a simple rounding error. On a category of that scale, 22% represents a massive financial drain every single year. Now, a poor rate on its own is not a crime. Sometimes it is the result of a passive buyer. Sometimes it is in legacy relationship that no one has put out for competitive bid. So, I took the standard compliance approach. I researched the supplier. Apex Cable Distributors was 5 years old. It had been added to our approved supplier directory in 2021 during my father's 8-month medical recovery, with a single authorizing signature, Tristan Vance. The business address pointed to a small suite in a Cranberry Township strip mall, which for a commercial cable distributor is a bit like running a shipping fleet out of a storage locker. Its registered agent was a name I had never encountered before: Marcus Croft. Its website consisted of 3 pages of basic stock photography, one of which still featured a visible watermark from a stock photo agency in the corner of a warehouse picture. I sat with all of this information for a long, focused evening. I didn't contact anyone. I didn't confront anyone. I had been the person who pointed out patterns in an executive meeting before, and I had watched how quickly a room can turn a woman's diligence into a joke. This time I would verify every single detail before I spoke up. I began printing out billing records, 5 full years of them. For 3 weeks, my dining table ceased to be a dining table. I arranged the invoices in chronological rows, taped index cards to the walls, and ate my meals standing at the counter. Julian was traveling more frequently that winter, client relations supposedly, so it was mostly just me, a yellow highlighter, and a growing coldness in my chest. Here is what the documentation revealed. Apex's pricing had increased in small, gradual increments. It was never enough to trigger an automatic audit, and always remained just slightly below the financial threshold that would have required a second authorizing signature. the exact threshold I had personally established. This meant someone had studied our internal controls and built their system precisely 1 inch below my radar. Certain purchase orders repeated themselves, identical quantities, identical line items, occurring like a steady heartbeat every few months. And a handful of the largest purchase orders were for materials I could not link to any active project number in our system. Commercial cabling for developments that did not exist. I cross-referenced the receiving logs, and they were signed, initialed, and complete. I was beginning to suspect they were entirely fabricated. You know that feeling when a word you have read 1,000 times suddenly looks incorrect. That was how my own company's documentation began to feel. Records I had trusted for years started looking like set pieces on a stage. I set a strict rule for myself that January verify everything. Do not assume. For every discrepancy, I wrote down the innocent explanation right next to the problematic one. I only retained the files where the innocent explanation required more imagination than the alternative. By February, I possessed a substantial stack of those files. The question was no longer whether funds were leaking from the business. The question was who was directing the flow. And I was married to the answer. I asked Julian about Apex Cable on a Tuesday evening over a dinner I had prepared specifically to make the discussion feel like a casual conversation rather than an interrogation. It tells you a great deal about the marriage we had built. I kept my tone light. Hey, I noticed something unusual today. Do you know much about Apex Cable distributors? Their rates seem high, and I can't find much background on the company. Julian's fork paused mid-air for a fraction of a second. If you have never watched someone you love freeze for a split second, I do not recommend it. Then he flashed his practiced smile and said, My mother is acquainted with the owner. It's fine, Clara. They are reliable people. Which owner? I asked. Marcus Croft. Because the corporate filings are very sparse, and we are overpaying by 6 figures annually. Julian set his fork down and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It wasn't guilt, it was patience. The deliberate patience of someone who had prepared for this exact conversation. You do this, he said gently. You take a spreadsheet and you turn it into a conspiracy. Your father's business is perfectly fine. Everyone is fine. Can we please have one dinner that doesn't involve an audit? We didn't argue. That is the detail people rarely believe. Neither of us raised our voices. No one walked away from the table. We spoke about his sister's family and a trip we would never actually take. We cleared the dishes and loaded the dishwasher side by side like 2 employees working a shift in a marriage. But something fundamental had shattered during that split-second pause. And we both knew it. He knew about Apex. He had always known. And when forced to choose between transparency with me and managing me, he had chosen management. His mother's native tongue. I approached my father in March 2024 with a clear, 1-page breakdown and a rate comparison so straightforward anyone could grasp it. 2 columns. What cable cost the market and what cable cost us. He read it through twice. For one brief moment, I watched my actual father reappear, the man who once removed a supplier from our approved list for sneaking a fuel surcharge onto an invoice. Then his expression hardened, and he said he would look into the matter quietly. I made the mistake of believing that looking into it meant an actual investigation. Here is what occurred instead, and I can pinpoint the exact timing because it still astounds me. I left his office at 11:40 a.m. At 6:15 p.m. that very evening, Eleanor Vance arrived at my parents' home with a beef bourguignon, unannounced. for the first time in 4 months. Beatrice Mercer's office and my father's calendar were the only 2 places my meeting had been recorded. You can do the math. I certainly did. Over dinner. My mother recounted this to me later, apologizing repeatedly. Eleanor wiped her eyes and spoke about how hard I had been working and how much pressure I was putting on myself. She talked about how Clara sees phantoms in the numbers because she cares so deeply. She never once mentioned Apex Cable. She didn't have to. She wasn't challenging my evidence. She was reframing me. I was no longer the compliance officer. I was the overwhelmed daughter. I was no longer the auditor. I was the highly stressed wife. It was a highly calculated move. You cannot easily fight it head-on because protesting only seems to confirm the narrative. By the weekend, my father was patting my hand and suggesting that perhaps I should take a short leave of absence. The quiet investigation never took place. And that Monday, for the first time in my 9 years at my own family's business, I received a meeting request from HR with no listed agenda. 3 employees had submitted formal complaints about me. The term Beatrice used was a pattern. She had adopted it from me, I suppose. A pattern of hostile, confrontational behavior that was creating a challenging work environment. All 3 complainants were on my red, circled list of 27. One of them was an individual I had spoken to exactly twice in my life, once regarding a parking space. Beatrice slid a memorandum across the desk with the practiced empathy of a doctor delivering bad news. It was suggested, in the passive voice where corporate decisions so often hide, that I work remotely for a period of time for everyone's comfort while the complaints were investigated. I want you to consider the sheer design of this. The defensive system I had spent years warning my father about was now identifying me as the threat. My security badge still functioned, technically. My name remained on the compliance policies, technically, but I was removed from the building. Tristan signed off on operations, Beatrice managed the internal reviews, and my father, whose business it actually was, told me over the phone. Sounding completely exhausted, that perhaps some distance would be healthy while things settled down. He wasn't a coward. I need you to understand that. He was a 62-year-old man with a recovering heart, a business he loved, and 2 competing versions of reality being presented to him daily, one of which arrived with home, cooked meals, and never required him to fight anyone. Alone in my car in the empty parking lot, I allowed myself one brief, highly emotional minute. Then, I drove to an office supply store and purchased 6 plastic storage boxes. If they were going to restrict my access to the physical building, I was going to secure my own copy of every single record. It turned out I had one specific stop to make first, though. Aisle 7. Purchase order 9912. $2,000 worth of commercial conduit ordered through Apex Cable. Officially marked as received according to a signed and initialed log into aisle 7 of our warehouse on a Thursday the previous October, right before my remote work exile began. I had one final afternoon in the building, and I spent it walking the warehouse floor with a clipboard, looking like an employee conducting a routine inventory count, but feeling like a person retrieving evidence. Aisle 7 is located at the very back of the facility, past the racks of grounding rods and heavy wire reels. It is a massive steel shelving unit that reaches nearly to the ceiling. According to our paperwork, $92,000 of inventory was resting on the 4th shelf. I stood in front of that shelf for a long time. The shelf was completely empty. It was not recently cleared, it was empty. A thick, undisturbed blanket of gray dust lay across the metal. the kind of accumulation that takes months to settle. There were no drag marks, no clean outlines where pallets had previously sat, and no forklift scuffs on the concrete floor below. Whatever that log sore had arrived, been unloaded, and placed on this shelf had never actually touched this steel. I pulled out my phone and took photos. A wide shot, a close-up of the undisturbed dust, the ISIL number painted on the frame, and timestamps on every single file. One empty shelf, gray and silent, representing more than the value of my vehicle. It is strange which specific moments change your perspective. It isn't always the spreadsheets. Documents can be disputed. Eleanor had demonstrated that to me in March, but no one can dispute dust. I stood in the cold light of the warehouse aisle and understood with absolute clarity that I was not losing my mind. I had never been paranoid, and things were going to get significantly worse before they improved. I emailed the images to my personal account, copied my personal legal counsel, and walked out past the security gate, offering a polite smile to everyone I passed. Keep that empty shelf in your mind. We will see it again. I gave my husband one final opportunity to choose. I wanted it documented on the record that I held the door open for him with both hands. It was a Sunday in early March 2025, nearly a year after the unannounced dinner. I placed the photos of ISIL 7 on our kitchen island alongside the Apex cable summary. Stand with me on this, I said. What take this information to my father together? Just the two of us. Whatever your family has done, you are not a part of it as of today. Julian stared at the photographs for a long time. And then my husband, the man who had remembered my coffee order back in 2015, said, "You are asking me to choose against my own mother. We protect our own Clara." There it was. Eleanor's wedding toast 9 years later, coming out of her son's mouth like a rehearsed line. I finally heard the phrase for what it had always been. It was never a promise of mutual support. It was a claim of ownership, a definition of family that prioritized the ledger over actual love. And I was on the wrong page of it. And so, though he would likely never realize it, was Julian. I heard myself reply with a level of calm that surprised both of us. If you have followed me this far, you know that isn't coldness. It is simply where I keep my backbone. All right, I said. Just those 2 words. I filed for divorce that Thursday, March 13, 2025, at the Beaver County Courthouse. The clerk who stamped my petition had kind eyes and a head cold, and wished me a pleasant weekend. Loss number 1 was now fully realized: my marriage. It had been effectively over for a year. Now it simply possessed a case number. What I did not know while standing at that counter was that ending my marriage had just started a countdown timer I couldn't see. My divorce attorney's name was Miriam Cole. She was 44, billed like an elite specialist, and spoke with absolute precision. The very first thing she did was temporarily disarm me. From this exact second until the final decree is signed, she instructed, "You do not touch anything at that company. No terminations, no vendor cancellations, no fraud memos, no dramatic confrontations. Nothing." I actually laughed. I possessed photos of an empty shelf worth $2,000 and a trunk full of files. I felt completely prepared. She did not laugh back. "Clara, listen to me carefully. Julian's legal team is going to argue that the growth of your father's business during your marriage is a marital asset. Your name is on the compliance records. The moment you start terminating his relatives and canceling contracts, they won't view you as a whistleblower. They will paint you as a vindictive spouse, trying to damage the asset to reduce his payout. Every true statement you make will be framed as a legal strategy. They will bury your evidence inside your alleged motive. I sat there deeply frustrated with her. The specific frustration you feel when someone is entirely correct. Everything I did would be true, and yet none of it would be believed. The scheme was no longer protected just by my father's misplaced loyalty. It was now protected by the divorce proceedings themselves. I had to wait or risk losing the business in my attempt to save it. So, here is the perspective I offer to anyone who has ever been criticized for waiting. Sometimes, the most decisive move you can make on a board looks exactly like sitting perfectly still. So, what am I permitted to do? I asked. Miriam smiled for the first time that afternoon, and I immediately understood why she was so respected in her field. Prepare, she said quietly. Legally, thoroughly, and completely. And when the countdown ends, ensure everything is already finished. The Vances dragged the divorce out for 15 months. At first, I interpreted it as pure spite. 2 requested extensions. A change of counsel halfway through that reset the entire timeline. Their team spent settlement conferences haggling over household furniture as if we were divorcing over a sofa. Fine, I thought. Take your time, because I was utilizing mine. I retained a forensic accountant named Sonia Patel out of Pittsburgh and paid her $35,000 from my personal savings. The fund I had set aside for a down payment on a home I no longer needed. It was either ironic or a financial planning issue, depending on how you viewed it. We worked nights and weekends. Walter Cross, my father's controller of 22 years, and the very first person inside the company who believed me, provided me with ledger exports he was authorized to access and quietly terrified to share. Together, we reconstructed 5 years of Apex Cable transactions. Every single invoice, every phantom purchase order, and every receiving log signed with the exact same tight initials. Sonia's analysis grew from 1 spreadsheet to 9 detailed tabs, eventually culminating in a summary page with a total figure that made even her fall silent during our phone calls. And buried deep in my compliance files, where it had rested in plain sight the entire time, I rear-examined the Apex Cable Master Supply Agreement and discovered the specific clause that reorganized my entire strategy. An automatic renewal, a 5-year term, renewing on its own unless canceled in writing at least 30 days prior to expiration. I verified the expiration date, then checked it again. I sat completely still at my dining table as my mental timeline shifted into a precise countdown. We had to cancel the agreement by late June 2026, or the business was legally locked into Apex Cable until 2031. 5 more years of financial loss, legally secured by my own department's standard template. And the divorce, the slow, dragging divorce, was scheduled to wrap up in mid-June. Once I identified the renewal date, the entire 15-month delay looked completely different, like a picture developing in reverse. I pulled the procedural history of my divorce and mapped it directly against the contract calendar, date by date. The first extension had been requested the week after Miriam served our initial financial disclosures, the week their legal team realized exactly what I had uncovered. The attorney change, which delayed discovery by 90 days, placed us neatly past the window where I could have pushed for an early resolution. Every single delay had pushed the finish line further to the right, closer and closer to that specific stretch of late June, until the timing was almost perfectly coordinated. The final decree would be signed roughly 48 hours before the last legal day to cancel the Apex Cable contract. 48 hours. They hadn't been delaying the divorce out of mere spite, greed, or standard legal stalling. They were running out the clock on a multi-million-dollar contract. Under the court-ordered freeze, I couldn't cancel anything while the case remained open. And if the case concluded only 2 days before the deadline, they were betting that a newly divorced woman, focused on moving and rebuilding her life, wouldn't immediately launch a corporate confrontation within 48 hours. Honestly, it was a reasonable assumption. It likely would have worked on almost anyone. I called Miriam and explained the contract clause. There was a brief pause on the line that I can only describe as highly respectful. "Then we do not delay a single day," she stated. "And Clara, they are going to expect you to be exhausted." I looked at the index cards on my wall, with the photo of the dusty, empty shelf taped right in the center like a cornerstone, and I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in 2 years. It wasn't dread, it was preparation. They believed they were running out my clock. They had absolutely no idea I had already synchronized my watch to theirs. Sonia's final report arrived in April 2026, 81 pages, spiral-bound at my request. It detailed in precise financial terms what I had been stating in emotional terms for 2 years. The total overcharges and phantom transactions routed through Apex Cable Distributors, LLC over 5 years amounted to $1.9 million. $1.9 million. I read the figure while standing up, then sat down and read it again. The report traced the journey of the funds from Sterling Industrial to Apex Cable, from Apex to a management services shell entity, and that shell entity's registered agent was the same name I had first seen on a sparse website years earlier, Marcus Croft. Sonia's corporate records appendix completed the connection I had never been able to prove from my kitchen table. Marcus Croft of Shaker Heights was a direct cousin of Eleanor Vance, listed in her mother's obituary as a beloved family member. The owner Mom was acquainted with. The reliable people. I want to describe what I felt in that moment, and it was not a sense of victory. Have you ever finally located the source of an unpleasant scent in your home? Actually found the source behind a specific wall. You feel a mixture of relief and nausea simultaneously, because now you have to physically open up the wall. My in-laws had inserted a financial straw right into the center of my father's business and quietly drained it for 5 years, all while sending us warm holiday cards and signing off on receiving logs with those tight, familiar initials, swearing that non-existent materials had arrived on empty shelves. Sonia matched the initials Tristan Vance, operations director, the helpful volunteer. I closed the report, aligned its edges neatly with the desk, the way I do when I need to keep myself centered, and wrote a single note on the cover in pencil. No one sees this until the decree is signed. 39 days to go. Let me pause here and ask you a question from one person to another. If you have ever tried to warn your family about a toxic individual, only to watch them believe the charming outsider instead of you, tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to know exactly what I had to sacrifice to get my hands free, stay with me because we are almost there. Subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of this journey. In May, 5 weeks before the scheduled trial, Eleanor made her primary move, and I must admit it was strategically brilliant. It arrived framed as an offer of peace. Julian's attorney proposed an informal family mediation, not a legal proceeding, but an emotional reconciliation, with Eleanor presiding. Tucked neatly inside the proposal was the actual trade. The Vances would completely withdraw their demand for a formal valuation of Sterling Industrial as a marital asset. The threat that had been hanging over my father's business like a dark cloud. if I would sign a comprehensive confidentiality agreement covering all personal and business matters. Read that again. They would stop claiming they were entitled to a portion of my father's business in exchange for my permanent silence about why they weren't. Miriam called it exactly what it was. They know what you have, Clara. Somewhere in 15 months of discovery, despite all our caution, a thread became visible, a subpoena that came a bit too close to Apex Cable. A deposition question Julian's attorney objected to just a fraction too quickly. They knew. And instead of panicking, they had priced it. That is the reality of Eleanor's world that I had finally learned to recognize. Everything is a negotiation, including the truth. Especially the truth. Every conflict has a settlement figure. Every misstep is just an invoice that hasn't been sent yet. And they were entirely certain I would accept it. Cautious, quiet Clara, who kept every piece of paperwork she was ever handed, who signed onboarding folders and quietly tolerated toasts. Of course she would trade the unpleasant truth for a clean, quiet exit. It is what she had done her entire life. I instructed Miriam to decline the offer politely, without presenting a counter offer. Her reaction made me laugh aloud in my empty apartment. Declined, she said. They just learned something very important about you. Expect them to get louder. They did get louder. Word reached me through my mother that Eleanor was telling their social circle I had experienced some sort of emotional breakdown and was intent on damaging both families on my way out. The local social network operated on her personal weather system, and the outlook on me was pity mixed with a clear measure of disapproval. That is when I broke my own rule, or at least half of it. The court ordered freeze restricted my actions at the company. Absolutely nothing restricted my actions at my parents' kitchen table. On Memorial Day weekend 2026, while my mother was out delivering a meal to a church gathering, I placed Sonia's forensic report directly in front of my father. I didn't say a single word while he read. He read for 40 minutes. My father is not a document-driven man. He moves his lips slightly when analyzing legal phrasing, a habit I have loved my entire life and would defend fiercely. Somewhere around the section detailing the receiving logs, that movement stopped. His hands went entirely still on the pages, and his shoulders dropped. I watched a man witness 5 years of his trusted handshakes undergo a clinical autopsy. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, and what he said broke my heart far more than anything Eleanor had ever managed. "You don't fire family," he said, but the words came out differently this time, smaller, less certain. It was no longer an absolute rule. It was a painful question. It was the sound of a man asking if the core principle he had built his life on had been picked up and used against him as a weapon. "No." "Dad," I said gently, taking his hand across the table. "You don't. But someone redefined what family means while we weren't looking. And I am going to need you to trust me on what happens next." He remained quiet for a long time. "What do you need from me, Clara?" "My entire life." I had waited for that exact question. I told him, "In 3 weeks. When I call you and say now, I need you to act. I want to tell you about the night before our final settlement conference. Because that was the night the actual conflict was decided, and I was the only person in the room. Everything was prepared. Sonia's report backups were secured. The contract cancellation letter was drafted. My father was on standby, and sitting alone in my apartment with a cup of cold tea, I found myself designing the quiet version of the story. You know the quiet version. Hand the forensic report to my father. Let him quietly terminate the 20, 7 individuals with a standard severance and a handshake let the Apex Cable contract quietly expire without a scene. No public attention, no legal filings, no confrontation at any table. The version where Clara quietly fixes everything and no one ever has to know Clara was right. I had been building quiet versions of situations my entire life. Quiet versions are what responsible daughters construct instead of causing scenes. We process the family's difficulties in private and label it strength. We sign the welcoming paperwork. We carry the peace as if it were a fragile object we were handed at birth and told never to drop. Staring at that cold tea, I finally did the math on it. 15 years of my quiet compliance had bought the Vance's time, cover, and $1.9 million. My silence had never once protected my family's business. It had protected the scheme. Those were the words I spoke aloud, alone in my kitchen at 100 a.m. Uttering them felt like setting down a heavy weight I had carried for so long I had stopped recognizing it as heavy. It had simply become my default posture. If the truth remained managed, it would remain deniable. It had to carry a cost in broad daylight. And the person it had to cost was me, my privacy, my comfort, my reputation for being reasonable. I sent a text to Miriam at 1:14 a.m. Take the deal to the mat. I'm done being the quiet one. She replied at 600 a.m. sharp about time. Here is what I traded away. I want you to hear the actual numbers, because this is the moment where people usually look at me as if I made a terrible mistake. The primary asset of our marital estate was our home in Upper Arlington. It was sold during the proceedings for $640,000. My rightful share should have been approximately $320,000. There were also retirement accounts to split, a question of spousal support, and Julian's attorneys still arguing for a share of my father's business growth. At the final settlement conference in early June, Miriam placed a single proposal on the table. I would accept only $40,000 from the home sale, just $40,000, and completely waive any claim to spousal support or retirement splits. In exchange, every member of the Vance family, by name and by business entity, would permanently release any and all claims, interests, or valuation demands against Sterling Industrial Electrical, its ownership, and its assets. Miriam drafted the clause so tightly it left no room for interpretation, covering Julian, Eleanor, Tristan, Marcus Croft, Apex Cable. Quoting directly, any affiliated person or entity, known or unknown. Their legal team reviewed the document, and you could see the calculation register in the room. She is paying us to go away. $250,000 of walking, away money from the tired, stressed, soon-to-be struggling ex-wife. They signed the agreement so quickly the notary had to ask them to slow down. Miriam looked at me one final time before I added my initials. You are paying them to release their hold on your father's business. You fully understand that. Every single dollar, I replied and signed. And that was the door closing behind me for good. The previous life. The house funds, the soft landing, the option of ever pretending none of this had occurred. All gone in blue ink by my own hand. People often think the point of no return is an event that simply happens to you. Sometimes you have to purchase it, June 16, 2026. The final hearing took exactly 11 minutes, which feels like an insultingly brief amount of time to conclude a 9-year marriage. But I have come to appreciate the efficiency of the court. At 9:31 a.m., the judge signed the final decree. My marriage was legally over. The liability releases were active, and the court ordered freeze Miriam's 15-month restriction, dissolved completely. Julian did not look in my direction in the corridor. Eleanor did not attend. she considered courthouses to be beneath her, which, given how much of her lifestyle's structure depended on legal frameworks, was a highly selective opinion. I walked out onto the steps of the courthouse, into the bright June sunshine, stood near a bronze historical statue, and checked my watch, which I had physically synchronized with the contract deadline calendar on my wall. 47 hours and change remained on the Apex cable cancellation window. They were betting I would go home and simply rest. Instead, at 9:40 a.m., exactly 9 minutes after my divorce was finalized, I called my father, who had been sitting by his phone since 7 that morning, because I had told him, no would be today. Dad, it's done. It's time. Let go of all 27. Walter has the documentation. The labor attorney has the termination letters ready. Security has been briefed. Beatrice goes first, before she has an opportunity to touch a single computer record. There was a brief pause on the line. In that silence, I could hear 34 years of you don't fire family being gently set down, like a tool that no longer fit the task at hand. Already have my work boots on, Clara, my father said. At 64 years old, he sounded 20 again. I laughed. Standing on the steps of the courthouse in a simple gray dress, newly single, financially depleted, holding a phone in one hand and 47 hours in the other, you have been waiting to find out how that phone call went. So had I, for 15 long months. What I had not anticipated was who would be standing at my door by dinner time. I was not physically present at the office for the terminations. That was Miriam's final piece of advice, and a highly practical one. Let it be the owner's decision, executed professionally by legal counsel. Keep it clean. But Walter called me that evening and walked me through the events, and I am going to share it with you exactly as he described it, because Walter Cross had waited 22 years to have the most interesting story at the dinner table. At 11:00 a.m., my father, our labor attorney, and a designated note taker set up in the smaller conference room. 27 individual meetings, 10 minutes each. The paperwork and folders were organized, legally sound, and kept intentionally routine. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic scenes, just documented, undisclosed conflicts of interest and related party transactions that directly violated signed company policies. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Here are the severance terms. Here is the exit. Beatrice Mercer went first, before her security credentials could grant her access to another personnel file. According to Walter, she said almost nothing, which felt more unsettling than a major scene would have. Experienced professionals do not argue in the moment. They immediately call their counsel. Tristan Vance, however, argued fiercely. He demanded my father's loyalty, then his gratitude, and finally, losing ground, cited his own initials on the receiving logs as proof of his diligence. The labor attorney took down those statements very slowly while Tristan watched him write. On his way out of the building, Tristan kicked a metal wastebasket. I want you to appreciate that of all the details, the kicked wastebasket is the one my father still brings up with genuine amusement. By 4:00 p.m., the process was complete. 27 vacant desks. Security collected access badges with the efficiency of a hotel checkout. And Julian never came into the office at all. At 4:20 p.m., my phone lit up with the only communication he would send me that entire year. You could have handled this quietly. I read the message twice, placed the phone face down on the counter, and whispered to my empty kitchen, yes, and that was precisely the problem. I was still standing there when the knocking began. It was loud, firm, and persistent. not the police, but the unmistakable sound of family. Eleanor Vance had never once visited my apartment. To do so would have required her to acknowledge its existence. And acknowledging its existence meant acknowledging the divorce, the 14 months I had been gone from the estate, and the entire collapse of her planned merger. But my address was recorded in the court filings, and there she was through my peephole at 7:00 p.m., wearing her diamond studs and a wool coat in June, her hand raised against my door. I opened it, because you simply do not get a moment like this twice in your life. 27 people, Clara, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her voice filled my small apartment completely. Ungrateful, unstable, vindictive. 27 innocent people with families, mortgages, plans. She actually brought up their personal lives in June. And what would our social circle say? Had I considered for a single second my father's standing in the community, dragging his own business through public scrutiny like this? I stood by my bookshelf and let the words wash over me, which felt like its own quiet triumph. 2 years earlier, that voice had the power to completely disrupt my nervous system. Now, it was just the sound of a storm against a window pane. And then she read the room, adjusted her strategy, and changed her tone. The volume dropped. Her posture softened. She sat down on my sofa, smoothed her coat, and became entirely warm. Clara, dear, we are all exhausted. Let me offer you a reasonable solution. And there it was, the exact same arrangement, dressed up as a compromise. Bring back the 15 who are genuinely uninvolved. Her phrase, a subtle admission hidden inside a gesture of kindness. 12 will step away quietly. We sign a mutual confidentiality agreement. No court filings, nothing public. Your father maintains his reputation. You maintain yours, and no one ever needs to know any of this. You are so skilled at keeping things running smoothly, dear. It is your best quality. There it was. My entire history of conflict avoidance appraised and offered back to me as praise by the one person who had always recognized exactly how I was wired and exactly how to leverage it. The clean exit, the quiet resolution, presented as a gift. A year ago, it would have worked on me. I looked at her for a long moment, and then I asked the question I had been holding on to since the day I finally understood her game. Eleanor, who signed your first welcoming paperwork? She went completely still, for one brief second, the only time I ever witnessed it. Eleanor Vance was not performing a role. My mother owned a small florist shop, she said finally, her voice carrying a gravelly tone I had never heard before, on Lee Road, Croft Florals. When I married into the Vances, my father, in-laws' liabilities were, she selected the word with extreme care, considerable. The florist shop was used as collateral that no one ever consulted my mother about. She discovered it at Thanksgiving. She helped set the table anyway. Eleanor smoothed her coat once more, and the gravelly tone disappeared beneath her polished exterior. I learned very early, Clara, that a woman in these families is either useful or she is simply furniture. I have spent 40 years ensuring I am useful. I made sure my sons married partners who were useful. That isn't cruelty. That is simply how the world operates. We protect our own, and there it was one final time. The toast, the password, the entire worldview. Love is a supply chain. Marriage is a procurement process. Her mother's florist shop had been leveraged decades ago, and the debt was still being collected from my father's warehouse floor. Eleanor was both the collector and, once long ago, the collateral. I felt the sudden, unexpected presence of actual empathy. I want to be honest about that. It was real, and it was there. And if she had stopped speaking right then, this might be a very different account. She did not stop speaking. She stood up, gathered her coat, and delivered the departure line she had undoubtedly rehearsed in her car. Sign the agreement, dear, because if this becomes public, the Sterling name will be a joke at every table in this county, and your father's health, God forbid, with all this unnecessary pressure. Consider carefully what you are choosing. Then she let herself out quietly, a woman entirely confident that the practical reality would do her work for her. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. Then I pulled out my phone and confirmed the 800 a.m. meeting for the following morning. The meeting she had no idea was scheduled. 38 hours remained on the clock. The main conference room on the second floor of Sterling Industrial is designed to hold 12 people and has almost never needed to. At 800 a.m. on June 17th, it held 2 representatives from our surety bonding firm, 3 executives from Vanguard Builders, our primary commercial client, representing 30% of our total annual revenue, my father, Walter, and me. Miriam had walked me through my options one last time the night before, and I want you to see the choice exactly as I saw it. Because this meeting was not legally mandated. No regulation forced our hand. We could have canceled the Apex Cable contract with a quiet, certified letter managed the 27 terminations as an internal reorganization and allowed the entire matter to fade away in private. Eleanor's preferred path minus Eleanor. My own preferred path, historically. The version of me who had kept every secret she was ever handed. Instead, I stood up in front of the 2 organizations with the greatest power to impact our future, and I turned on the projector. The first slide was a photograph of an empty steel shelf, covered in gray dust, with the aisle number clearly visible on the frame. This shelf, I began, is where $92,000 of commercial conduit was officially signed for. It was never there. I took this photograph more than 2 years ago, and today I can finally explain to you why I had to wait to show it. I laid out the entire situation for them, keeping my tone as calm as a weather forecast. The details of Apex Cable, the $1.9 million, the 27 terminations, the initials on the logs, and our formal referral to a white-collar crime specialist whose engagement letter my father had signed at 7:15 that morning. Then I picked up the contract cancellation letter, and with 24 hours remaining on the automatic renewal clock, I signed it at the head of the table and handed it to Walter to be sent via certified mail, return receipt requested. The Vanguard executives asked direct, difficult questions for over an hour. The surety bonding representatives asked even tougher ones. And at the conclusion, exactly as Miriam had warned, Vanguard's senior director closed his folder and delivered the news that hurt. We are pausing the Meridian Commercial Development Project, pending our own independent review. 90 days of delay. $1.4 million in projected revenue suspended, because I had chosen to use the word fraud aloud in a conference room instead of whispering reorganization in a hallway. My father looked down. I didn't. It wasn't because the loss didn't sting. It was because I had already processed that cost at 100 a.m. with a cup of cold tea, and I understood the value of what I was purchasing. Information travels quickly in a county like ours, and Eleanor's prediction materialized within the week. The local paper published an article framing the situation as a highly contentious divorce impacting a prominent local business, with my name featured prominently in the lead paragraph. The word vindictive was heavily implied between every line. She had anticipated that outcome correctly. She had simply miscalculated what I was willing to pay. You were right, Eleanor. I thought to myself, folding the newspaper. We protect our own. That is exactly what I am doing. Here is the accounting after 90 days, and then after 5 months. Vanguard Builders returned to us. Their internal auditors spent 6 weeks examining our financial records, found exactly what we told them they would find, and absolutely nothing we hadn't disclosed. Their senior director met with my father over coffee in that same conference room and shared that in 30 years of business, he had never had a contractor open its own wounds in front of him, and that honesty was the sole reason they were continuing the relationship. Our surety bonding company renewed our coverage with standard conditions we were more than willing to meet. The legal case ended the way these matters typically do, quietly, through negotiation rather than a dramatic courtroom scene. Marcus Croft's attorneys negotiated a civil settlement, $1.1 million to be repaid over a 4-year period. Apex Cable was formally dissolved, and the documentation remains in a secure file drawer where everyone involved knows it sits. 2 of the 27 terminated employees attempted to sue for wrongful termination. Both cases were dismissed due to the signed conflict of interest disclosure forms I had mandated years prior, back when Beatrice was laughing at my diligence in leadership meetings. Equipment warranties rid for relaxation, indeed. The company operates with 189 employees now. We are a leaner organization, running under a procurement policy I drafted that is robust enough to withstand any challenge. And the Vances. Their lights are still on. That is the reality of these situations that no one prepares you for. There is no sudden dramatic ending. Eleanor still chairs local benefits. Her social circle still welcomes her, somewhere in this county tonight. She is remembering the names of influential families and managing her world with absolute poise. Julian was engaged again by the holidays, to a woman his mother had introduced him to. I genuinely hope it goes more smoothly for her than the initial plan suggests. Their social structure continued to function. It simply no longer functions through our business. And it turns out that is the true objective, not their complete setback, but our ability to keep our own door locked, with me holding the key instead of signing the welcome paperwork. In November, 5 months after that pivotal meeting, my father asked me to walk the warehouse floor with him, which has always been his primary way of connecting. He stopped at aisle 7, in front of the 4th shelf. It was neatly stacked with commercial conduit, verified and labeled for an active project, sourced from a supplier Walter had thoroughly vetted. My father stood looking at it the way some people look at stained glass. I terminated family, he said quietly. I should have listened to family. That was the extent of his apology. And if you knew Arthur Sterling, you would understand that it was everything. Then, he formally offered me the role of president of the company, with him transitioning to chairman, spending his time on the shop floor and keeping his hands off the organizational chart. I accepted on one strict condition, and I made him shake on it right there in the warehouse aisle. Every single hire from this day forward goes through a 3-person review panel, no exceptions, no matter whose last name is on the application, including a Sterling. Especially a Sterling. He laughed, then realized I was entirely serious and shook my hand firmly. At the company gathering that autumn, I wore my new identification badge for the first time. Clara Sterling, president, a local electrician's daughter, standing beside a system you could finally trust, carrying her own name. The name I was born with, the one no one had introduced into the business as a favor, The one I had finally stopped apologizing for using to read the fine print. If there is one principle I would place over every family's door, it is this: keeping the peace is not the same thing as keeping the family whole. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do for the people you care about is to finally refuse to stay silent. The empty shelf in aisle 7. A welcoming packet I personally signed, 9 minutes after a legal stamp. That is my experience. Now, tell me yours. What boundary do you wish you had established much sooner in your life? Let us know in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to their secret stories, because our next journey goes even deeper. Take care of yourself. That is protecting your own too.